Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 8 of Two Cooks Talking. I am your host, Nguyen. I am not an expert on cooking, but I am pretty decent about food. With me is my co host, Executive Chef Michael Weller, who is an expert on cooking.
And I know a little bit about food. I would grant that. And Long, you're decent about a lot of things.
I'm just a decent guy in general.
There you go.
So we're going to go into another singular topic this week. This time, this is from a request by listener Emily Grover. We're going to talk about butter, Mike.
Yay.
Butter is it's one of my favorite things to consume. I remember I was watching a cooking video on YouTube just recently with the guy from MythBusters, I forget his name, Adam Savage or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
Yep.
and he was had a chef friend that was cooking eggs for him, and she mentioned that one of the dirty chef restaurant secrets is they just put a lot of butter and stuff, and then people like it because of that.
I've never hit it. It
Yeah,
doesn't need to be a secret.
yeah,
Butter is a delicious food.
yeah.
Butter is a wonderful fat. Butter does amazing number of different things. I love butter. I love
Yeah,
butter.
I mean, I don't know who really doesn't. Even if you're counting calories, a lot of people will make a little bit of room for butter just because it's that good and it's that valuable for your taste buds.
One of my favorite culinary stories is for 30 plus years on her TV shows and in live appearances. Julia Childs was skeptical of margarine and would say over and over and over again, don't really know what this margarine is, don't like it, doesn't work, use butter and use it in moderation.
Mhm.
And she lived long enough to be, backed up by science.
Yeah.
And the trans fats in margarine are horrible.
Yep.
And I'm not saying butter's a health food, but neither did she.
Yeah.
Moderation is the key.
So let's dive back into what butter is. Butter is what is it's a churned cream, right?
But it is originally it's the fat that rises as you churn fresh milk.
Hmm.
So smorgasbord, the Swedish open-faced sandwich feast, originally came from the word smorgas, which is geese, the little lumps of butter that rise to the surface as you churn fresh milk. Those little lumps of butter in the poetical past looked like geese. Um, what's left after you get the butter out of the fresh milk is buttermilk, which is
Right.
why buttermilk is so low in fat. You've taken the butter out.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's butter.
Did butter originate from is has it always originated from cow's milk, or was it oh, I don't know
I,
if
I can't say absolutely, and I
okay.
know if I don't say absolutely, one of our wonderful listeners will call me on it.
Yeah.
I know that cow's milk makes an excellent butter.
Mhm.
Um, Cow's milk tends to be high in fat.
Right.
And what we tend to think of in this country as butter is a cow's milk derivative.
Okay. Um, so what else about butter? I mean, we have cow's butter. I assume there's some goat milk butter as well that is made.
You could probably make camel milk butter. Right? We're just taking the fat out of the natural byproduct of what makes us mammals here.
Right.
So cows have been bred for centuries to produce milk,
Mm.
and from that milk butter. And almost always originally that butter would be salted
Hmm.
for preservation purposes. We talked about that in our little episode on salt. It's a weird perspective. I recently got educated by friends on this topic. When I say butter from a restaurant background, I always by default think butter is unsalted butter.
Right.
Never saw salted butter in a restaurant or professional kitchen. If you need salt, you put salt in things.
Hmm.
And we tend in a professional setting not to buy things that already have the seasoning added.
Right.
But come to find out, in the world out there at large, the default answer for what butter is salted,
Right.
which took me some getting used to. But historically, it makes sense. butter will go bad. If you add salt to the butter, it will not go bad as quickly.
And living in California like we do, we have the luxury of in the northern part of California, we have the luxury of having moderate climates where we live. So I know I've gotten in the habit of leaving butter covered, but on my counter. And you're talking about preserving food and food safety and things like that. So let's talk about butter on the counter. You're shaking your head and smiling as I say this. What are your thoughts, Mike?
Legally,
Yep.
technically,
Uh-huh.
don't do it. Practically, I hate hard cold butter over warm soft bread. It tears everything up trying to put it on. There are times when cold butter is a better application in cooking, but you can somewhat, not completely, but somewhat get around some of the concerns about keeping butter on your counter by using a butter urn that provides a water lock. So the way it works is the butter goes into the lid section of the crock or urn, and that gets pushed down into a pool of water so that there is no air contact with the butter in the lid. Water makes a seal. It's not ideal. It's not perfect. It's not legal, but it does eliminate some of the risk.
Okay. So when we're talking about risk, what are we talking?
Bacteria eats.
Right.
Bacteria eats food. Butter is, there's a reason butter is fattening.
Yeah.
Butter is a wonderful food. It's high in proteins and fats. It's got a ton of sugars. If microorganisms eat, butter will feed them. And so typically the rule with that is you keep that below 40 degrees. I will tell you that without getting any good friends in trouble, I don't know of a pastry kitchen that doesn't have room temperature butter pretty much on hand. Somehow,
Yeah.
it's just there and it's room temperature. I don't know how that happens. But in a professional kitchen, under sanitation rules and laws, you keep the butter cold.
I wanted to take a brief step back and talk about the churning process a bit. Just because we say churning, we know what a butter churn looks like. It looks like kind of like a barrel shape with a broomstick coming out of it. What exactly is churning? Is it, I don't know if you want to describe kind of the mechanics of it.
Yeah, I can give you a simpler description of an urn that works. As a matter of fact, our listeners can do this very same thing. Put some fresh cream in a plastic bag, seal the top of the bag, shake the bag for 10 minutes, you'll get butter. The agitation adds energy. The energy breaks down protein molecules. They then cling together in a new form that turns the liquid into a solid, leaving behind the water that gets expressed from the fat as the proteins coagulate. Little Miss Muffet sat in her tuffet eating her curds and whey. The curds are the coagulated proteins. The whey is what's left behind. That's technically cheese, not butter,
Right.
but it's the same process.
That's good to know.
I mean, if you're really bored someday,
Yeah.
make your own butter.
Yeah, I've actually seen a fun little video of a guy making butter out using a mason jar. So same principle. Mason jar is probably just easier to shake than a little plastic bag.
Yep. I've done it in class as well, talking about butter. And you just have the bag or the jar passed around from student to student in the class, and inevitably a student will shake something. It just happens. And by the time it's made a couple cycles around, somebody looks down and says, "Ah!" Because there's actual butter there. It's not that hard of a process.
Right.
Not difficult.
Okay. So let's talk about the different types of butter. Talk about salted butter. There's unsalted butter, sweet cream butter. I don't know if that's any really different than unsalted.
That's unsalted.
Yeah,
It tends to be unsalted. It's also a marketing term. To my knowledge, it doesn't have a legal definition. You'll pay more for sweet cream butter because, man, that sounds good. To my knowledge, there is no legal definition of what that is.
Okay. So I don't know if there are any other types of butter that you regularly find. Those are pretty much the two things you find in stick form.
That's the two big divisions. There are, and we're lucky, as you mentioned, we live in a climate that's temperate. Now, whatever that does for butter on the counter, it does mean that surrounding the places where we live, there are areas of prairie and grass and rolling hills and dairy cow. And we have a huge dairy cow presence in our neighborhood, in our general Bay Area. And there's wonderful artisanal butter. There are butters that are made from different breeds of cow. Different breeds of cow have different fat contents. So, as with everything, where a food product comes from influences the way that product tastes. So there are famous butters around the world that come from specific locations. One of the classic cases is if your cow's pasture is near the ocean and the grass is watered every morning by the fog that rolls in, the cows that eat that grass will naturally pick up some of that salt, and their milk will naturally have a bit of salt in it, and it affects the taste.
Oh.
So, but really, it's salted or unsalted.
Right.
Until you start cooking.
Okay. What happens when you start cooking?
One of the most wonderful things that happens when you start cooking. People come in and they look at you when you're cooking. All kinds of good things happen when you start cooking. But if you cook butter, you can brown it.
Right. And we talked a little bit on our steak episode about using the brown butter as a basting solution for steak.
Yep.
And all the kind of the nutty flavors that come from brown butter, which is probably
The French call it beurre noisette for hazelnut, for both the color and the aroma that comes from the butter at that point. I have good friends in the pastry department who make chocolate chip cookies, and instead of regular butter, they use brown butter as a pastry ingredient, and you get that whole nutty overtone. It's not even fair.
And then other parts of the cooking process, you've got clarified butter, and I guess what's left of clarified is that ghee that's left over from the clarified.
If you brown it first.
Okay.
So clarification separates the milk solids and the water and the butter. So it stratifies into 3 layers. You skim off the top, you ladle off the middle and keep it. If you brown the solids on the bottom before you do that separation, you technically get ghee.
Okay.
Ghee is a rarity in our world. We've talked about how milk mostly comes from temperate northerly regions, but the water buffalo in India is a tropical mammal. And so in India they have a ready supply of butter, but at 110 degrees it's not going to keep.
Right.
So ghee is a process of clarifying it, which will enable it to keep much longer at ridiculously high temperatures, and it adds a characteristic flavor base to a lot of mostly northern Indian cooking.
Got it. Okay. And then I want to talk about clarified butter a bit, because clarified butter, I've never really used it because there's kind of a process to clarify butter. I don't know if you want to you dive into it briefly, but if you want to go into a little more. But then there are also special properties of clarified butter, such as it doesn't have the smoke point that butter has, which is pretty important for.
You can cook clarified butter to a much higher temperature because you've taken out those little particles,
The milk solids.
the milk solids that burn. The milk solids are what burns at a low temperature. If you get rid of them, you can bring clarified butter up pretty high. You can cook, you can saute in it.
At that point, it's mostly fat, right? That's kind of left over.
And it's fat without impurities. It's also traditionally used, just for reasons I've never quite fathomed, as drawn butter, as something to dip lobster into. Now, dipping lobster into butter is not any idea of a nightmare. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
But a traditional accompaniment to lobster is drawn butter.
Right.
Just dunk it in butter. But I had at one point in my career a large-scale debate with a bunch of classically trained French chefs over what is the actual ingredient in a butter sauce, a hollandaise.
Mm-hmm.
And the original recipe just says melted butter. And when the actual French translation showed up as melted and not clarified, the particular chefs who I love and adore, I was debating with, said, yes, but your American butter is not the same. You need to clarify it. So there you go. Another possible difference for clarified butter is in making a butter sauce.
Okay. Um, are there different gradations for butter? I haven't really looked on the shelf that much. Kind of like how, eggs and meat, you have grade A, grade B, so forth. Is butter just butter?
Butter is butter.
Okay.
And another use for butter is finishing a sauce. So probably at a later episode, if our listeners would like, we'll talk about when we've dipped into it a little bit, what an emulsion is.
Right.
When fat and water are held together without separating out.
Mm-hmm.
Butter is fat and water held together. It's an emulsion as it sits there on your counter, not for long on your counter, but on your counter. So if you whisk cold butter into a hot sauce, you're effectively thickening the sauce slightly and making it glossy and shiny. The French say monter à beurre. It's finishing a sauce by whisking in cold butter. If you do the technique poorly, if the butter isn't cold, if the sauce is too hot, if you don't whisk well enough, you can break it. So traditionally, if you're really good, it's not even whisked. It's swirling in a saute pan. Pieces of cold butter are dropped into a hot pan sauce and swirled until they become one with the sauce without ever getting hot enough to break into water and fat and split the sauce. And if you do that, if you monte à beurre correctly, the sauce gets thicker and shinier and more wonderful, and you just snuck another handful of butter into your recipe, which is never a bad thing.
Okay. All right. What are some? All right, what's your favorite application of butter?
I'm gonna cop to stealing from Jacques Pepin. Wonderful book out there of famous last meals, 40 famous last meals. They asked a bunch of chefs what they would have as their last meal.
Mm-hmm.
And Jacques Pepin kind of, he hemmed and hawed. He gave two answers, but his first answer was really wonderful, I thought. He said, if the bread is good and there's butter, that wouldn't be a bad last meal. Hot bread, out of the oven just long enough to finish baking, rested 20 minutes out of the oven, tear a piece off, slap some really good butter right on top. If you're feeling extravagant, hit it with a little pinch of salt. That's not so bad for butter.
What's funny is that was actually my answer too. Buttered bread is one of my favorite things.
Well, we're in good company.
Yeah, it's kind of like everything you want for an savory, and I do add the salt, so like a kind of a savory, salty, either snack or accompaniment to your meal. It's kind of it's kind of perfect for me.
It's hard to beat.
Yeah,
It really is. Other things I like with butter, though, I love a butter-enriched sauce. I love brown butter as a flavoring.
Mm-hmm.
Veal Cordon Bleu, chicken Cordon Bleu, is a chicken breast stuffed with butter, rolled, breaded, and deep fried.
Mm.
So that when you cut into it, all that warm melted butter in the middle comes oozing out. Not so bad.
I never knew that there was actually butter in that. I thought when I have chicken cordon bleu, it's usually with cheese and like ham inside the chicken.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know that there's a lot of butter in that too. Which
There's a lot of butter.
yeah,
It
I'm a
helps.
big fan. I mean, you look at French cuisine, and French cuisine itself has quite a bit of butter.
Again, you've got to. I think anytime we say French cuisine, American cuisine, Indian cuisine, Italian cuisine, we have to be careful because cuisines are smaller than that. So southern France is much more Italian in feel. There's not a lot of butter used in the south of France. It's an olive oil place. One of the ways you can tell, if you dropped me on a planet and gave me 20 questions to figure out where I was, my first question is, what fat did they use? Right? So if it's butter and I'm in Italy, I know I'm in northern Italy because that's where the cows are. If it's butter and I'm in France, I'm in northern or northeastern or northwestern Brittany area of France because southern France is olive oil and southern Italy is olive oil. So it varies with region what the fat of choice is. But yes, traditional, classic northern French cuisine is somewhat heavy in butter.
Yeah.
It does wonderful things.
Yeah. Another thing that you kind of dip your toe in just a little bit earlier, margarine. So let's talk margarine versus butter. Margarine is a vegetable oil based butter substitute. I guess is how you can best describe
Yeah.
it. Yeah. It's
It's grease made without cholesterol.
yeah, and it's made in a laboratory.
And making something in a laboratory, just to be clear, doesn't make it bad.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of things get made in a laboratory that come out pretty well.
Yeah.
But that being said, to get all molecular on it, typically in a long length of chain molecule of fat, the ends of the fat molecules are covered in hydrogen ions. If every link on the chain of fat is covered by a hydrogen ion, you get a saturated fat. Saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with vegetable oils, again, the difference between a fat and an oil is an oil is liquid at room temperature and a fat is solid at room temperature.
Right.
So a vegetable oil isn't solid at room temperature, but you can chemically force extra hydrogen ions to cap off the molecules in the chain and make it saturated even though it's a vegetable oil. You then make it a trans fat or a saturated fat made from a vegetable source, and it tends to be solid at room temperature
Right.
and something your body can't process.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been lots of research about the negatives of trans fats. I try to take them out of my diet as much as I can, including like partially hydrogenated oils and things like that. And then with margarines, we're talking about things like Country Crock is probably the biggest selling margarine on the market. I know one benefit that I used to enjoy about Country Crock is that you can stick it in the fridge, pull it out, and it'll still be spreadable.
Oh, sure will. Yeah, there you go. You've named an event. It's like, I dare you to say something nice about me. You've said something nice about margarine. Well done. The problem is, and the big difference is, butter is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So here's another nice thing to say about margarine.
Yeah.
It's cheaper than butter. It tends to, in a pastry application, lards are really good and shortenings are really good at making a flaky crust or a flaky biscuit, a flaky croissant.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with those applications being when it comes to the eating portion. Another difference between butter and margarine is butter melts at body temperature, margarine doesn't. So who cares? That's like some trivial science fact. We all care because when you put, not to knock them, let's just say a cheap pastry in your mouth, it might look flaky and wonderfully risen and delicate and beautiful, but if they used a shortening to make it that way, it will look great. When you put it in your mouth, your first bite will be wonderful until you feel a coating all around your palate, on the inside of your teeth, because margarine doesn't melt at body temperature. And when you eat a food made with margarine, it coats your whole palate. Compare that with eating a croissant with butter, made with butter. You bite in, you get the texture, you get the initial mouthfeel, and the butter melts.
Mm-hmm.
And it slides down your throat carrying all those complex flavors with it and away. There's nothing coating your mouth. You're ready for another bite. It's a wonderful thing. And that's a huge difference between butter and margarine.
And as far as applications go, does margarine have those browning I guess properties or any of the cooking things that you're looking for butter. I mean, it's just butter flavored oil, kind of, right?
It's a fat
Yeah.
with a butter flavor. Now, I don't want to get called on this. I worked at coffee shops for a long time, and I made, 24/7 diners. And I have made thousands of pounds of hash browns on a flat top grill. I will tell you that a butter flavored oil makes a mighty fine hash brown. You don't have to worry about the temperature. You
Right.
can heat it to a much higher temp. You can brown the hash browns much deeper and darker. That artificial butter flavor isn't butter, but man, in the middle of a stack of hash browns at 3 a.m., it's mighty good stuff.
And the downfalls in that case aren't as big because you have oil and potatoes and oil is like it's damn good eats.
It works. It works. So there you go. I guess you could. I'm not much of a mechanic, but you could use margarine in that kind of application.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you a question. I actually never thought about this question until we just started recording this podcast. Since butter is a dairy food and typically made from cows in America, is there a lactose concern? I don't even. There's a lactose concern, so lactose intolerant people may have issues with butter.
Yes.
Okay, was not aware of that.
And people watching their cholesterol. This is an animal-based product. It's a cholesterol concern. It's a lactose concern.
Right.
It does not have gluten, so it's not a gluten concern. Just to go down the list of the biggies here.
All right. What else about butter? Is there anything else?
Wow, butter.
I mean, we dipped our toes in a lot of different things. We didn't go too far in depth on some stuff, so I don't know if there's anything about the history of butter. We talked a little bit about the smorgasbord, kind of.
I mean, if we want to just devolve this into interesting facts about butter,
Yeah, sure.
Ireland is famous for the potato. For good reason. At a time when Ireland was subjugated by Great Britain, the poverty-stricken Irish in Ireland would typically hold on to a cow, the potatoes they planted for themselves, and that was enough. If you keep the skin on the potato and you add butter, you get enough nutrients to stay alive. If you add in a green, so the classic Irish dish is Cordon, which is potatoes and butter and green cabbage or green kale. And those three things will keep you alive indefinitely. I like potatoes and butter and cabbage. I don't know how long I want to stay alive on it, but butter does provide a lot of our nutritional needs.
Yeah.
Not great for us either. It's one of the things people will tend to give up.
Yeah. Sadly.
You can get around that easier than you can get around, for instance, giving up salt.
Yeah.
Right? Oils are a wonderful base to cook in. You can monte, you can thicken that and then glossify a sauce with other fats. It doesn't have to be butter. But it's really tough to get around.
Yeah. And then you talking about greens made me think of another application for butter that's commonly used is infusing butters and whipping butters with herbs and things like that. I know one application that I really enjoyed was I forget some steakhouse back in Texas. I think it was Saltgrass. I don't know if it's a chain. It's a chain, but I don't know if it's a wide chain outside of Texas. But one of my favorite things is they would whip their butter with cinnamon, and then you would spread that on bread, and it's actually pretty good.
So technically that's a compound butter.
Yeah, compound butter is what I'm looking for.
Yeah, so wonderful thing to put on a piece of fish. The key being that you put it on a piece of hot, typically protein, right before it's served. And so this butter that you've infused with spices or herbs is then typically cut into discs or piped out into little rosettes and chilled.
Right.
And placed on top of the hot food so that as it's carried from the kitchen to the table, it begins to melt. And fat carries flavor. Very important. People say fat is flavored. Fat is not flavored. Fat carries a lot of flavor.
Yeah.
So the fat carries the flavor over the top of the food, and it's a delicious thing. By the same token, it's one of the big culinary sins, using compound butter. If the butter doesn't melt, you're insulting your guest. If you put a big pat of compound garlic rosemary butter on top of a piece of steak and you carry it out and you set it in front of me in the dining room and that butter's not melting, I'm sending it back. My steak isn't hot enough to melt butter. It's going back to the kitchen.
Interesting.
Right. It's just a little, maybe a chef tip or insight, but it's vital if you're going to use butter melted over the top of something that the something be hot enough to melt the butter.
Right. Huh. And what's the process of compounding butter? Is it just whipping it with a whisk, or?
Yeah, typically you allow the butter to come to room temperature, or warm it slowly. You don't melt it. Typically it's not melted, it's just softened. And then any number of flavorings can be added to it. The sky is the limit, really. Yeah. Typically cut small enough that it can be carried by the butter as it melts. And then either placed into a piping bag and piped into little rosettes or fanciful shapes.
As it sets it cool so that you can do that, obviously.
Right,
or,
so it's never
melted. Right.
It's only softened. Softened butter will pipe.
Yeah.
So you can do anything with a soft butter that you can do with buttercream. You make all kinds of beautiful shapes with a piping bag, then set them in the fridge to chill and harden, and then use them on top of the food. A quicker method, probably more commonly used, is to take the softened butter and put it on a sheet of baking paper or parchment and roll it into a log and chill it. And then that log of butter is sliced, so you get a round disc to put on top of each piece of food that you send out with compound butter.
I'm imagining a sushi roll of butter kind of effect.
Really great description. Perfect, yes.
I don't know if you had anything else about butter. Did you want to?
I want to eat some.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good. All right, well, that does it for episode 8 of Two Cooks Talking. I've been your host, Long Nguyen.
I've been Mike Weller.
And you can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/2cookstalking with the number 2. You can send us an email at twocookstalking@gmail.com. You can visit our website at twocookstalking.podbean.com. And hopefully pretty soon I'll get this uploaded, if not by now, onto iTunes. So maybe we'll look into that, and I'll let you know in the future if that happens. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.